We've already spent a lot of time in the Lascaux caves, but I want to return to our big four analytical categories and use them to look at this work briefly once again. So, what do we know about the function of this work? Not a whole lot in the end, although we have some intriguing clues. Its function does not appear to be hunting instruction. These weren't the animals these people hunted. The dark, narrow spaces where the paintings are found suggest secret rituals for a few selected individuals more than it does group gatherings. The most recent theory is that the paintings represented or maybe even induced shamanistic trances, but really we don't know. Just for a point of contrast, what would you guess about the function of this famous work of prehistoric and historic art, which I'm betting many of you will actually recognize? This huge slab of rock stands next to the one water source in the area, Indian Creek. So lots of people would have passed this way, and you can too. Unlike All American Man, this art is very accessible. It's right off the road to the Needles District of Canyonlands National Park in southern Utah. Note that I practice what I preach. Back to newspaper rock. Here's a close-up of one section. Notice anything that seems out of place in this panel? How about the guy on horseback, holding a bow and arrow, and reins? We know, in fact, that people from several cultures, the Anasazi, the Fremont, the Ute, maybe even the Navajo, carved images into this panel over the past 1,500 years. And that's why it's called newspaper rock. Although we don't know for certain, it seems likely, given the prominent, convenient location, that this did indeed function as a kind of public bulletin board. Bring home some elk bones, dear. I'm making soup. The content, on the other hand, seems rather similar to what we see in the European Paleolithic caves. An admixture of animals and people, feet, often we see hands, geometric forms, and what looks like a shaman figure, leaving aside that much later fellow on horseback. Whatever its function, this appears to have been much more public art. Back to Lascaux. We talked briefly about technique, the use of oil to bind paints and scaffolding to paint high in the caves. Archaeologists have determined that the Lascaux artists did not use paintbrushes. The broad black outlines of the figures were probably created with mats, pads, or swabs of moss or hair, or even with blobs of raw color. Judging by the number of hollow color-stained bones discovered at Lascaux and elsewhere, the larger painted areas were probably created using a kind of prehistoric spray painting, with paint being blown through a tube made from bone, wood, or reeds onto the rock surface. We also know that they used flat rocks for artists' paint palettes. The Lascaux artists likely used three graphic techniques: painting, drawing, and engraving, sometimes independently and sometimes in combination. So, for example, two methods were necessary to complete the Great Black Bull in the axial gallery. The head and most of the body appear to have been sprayed, while an implement, a mat or a pad or a swab, acting like a brush, was used to paint the upper part and the tail. Drawing was done with the same implements, but also with edged chunks of manganese or iron oxide. Engraving, probably the most common artistic technique used at Lascaux, involved scratching away the outer layers of rock, which generates a difference in color. The resulting engraved line looks just like a drawing. In addition, thicker engraved lines were sometimes used to give added volume, really relief to the outlines of animal figures. Again, these were amazingly sophisticated artists. We'll talk a lot more about all of these techniques, so consider this another trailer. Now let's turn to form. What kind of lines do you observe in these Lascaux images? The bull on the upper right shows a clear contour line. The line of the equines, by contrast, is really created by color. There's no explicit contour line. What about shapes? Well, the reindeer's horns seem organic, if not extraterrestrial, while the dots below it are much more geometric. And, we talked about this last time, is there a focal point? Well, I would say not really, again, partly because images were painted over a long period of time and sometimes superimposed. Dramatic as these works are, they don't really display a formal composition, at least to my eye. We run into a similar problem interpreting our next image, which is the running horned woman. She is surrounded by other images, but many do not date from exactly the same period. Notice that some of the smaller figures are superimposed over her body. The term for that, by the way, is palimpsest. I've never seen it on an AP test, but now you know it. This too is a cave painting, but these paintings were shallow. These caves were shallow and inhabited, suggesting again a more public art like that found on newspaper rock. Any other ways this reminds you of Utah? Actually, like southern Utah, this region of Algeria was once much wetter. During the Neolithic era, enough rainfall fell to allow a pastoral lifestyle, that is, herding of domesticated animals. Over time, the climate changed and the area dried. Intriguingly, the subjects of the art changed with the climate. Camels, for example, replaced cows. Let's watch this short video from UNESCO, which introduces the region and its art. So here we see our running horned woman juxtaposed with some of the other rock art from Tassila. I think this is amazing. I was very excited to be introduced to this. I was not familiar with this. You'll hear me complain from time to time about the new College Board curriculum, but I consider this to be one of its real benefits. So what do you notice about the content of these works as compared, say, with the paintings in Lascaux? Well, we see a lot more people and a lot more scenes of daily life. Note the hunters in the upper right, and the herders and the women and children in the lower left. However, the painting in the right bottom corner, which you also saw in the video, seems to have a more supernatural content. So where does our running horn woman fit into this cast of characters? She could be performing a ritual dance, and that seems to be the leading theory, especially since she appears to be decorated with either paint or scars. As you saw from their reading, there's some debate about which. These decorations are still found in the traditions of people in this area. But she might also be a goddess or imitating a goddess, and the best evidence for that is the horns, which are often associated with gods. Here, by the way, are some of the other horn deities we will encounter in this course. Do you remember Hathor, the cow deity from the Ballad of Narmer? We'll meet the conquering god king Naram Sin in our next unit, and the other two when we study Mesoamerican and African art. Why would you guess are horns so often associated with deities around the world? Well, there's no way this answer isn't going to sound sexist, sorry. Horns are found primarily on large male animals, and they are used primarily to fight. Usually the most dominant bulls, that is, the male cattle, bison, elk, etc., had the biggest and most impressive horns. So horns were a symbol of strength, a symbol of virility, and a symbol of triumph over lesser foes. Consider it iconographic chest thumping. Now, one of your readings presented a related theory about this work. What was it? Well, one author speculated that the woman was performing a dance associated with rain, or was a goddess associated with rain. Note the speckles surrounding her face and what looks like a rainbow held by the woman below her. It's an intriguing theory, well supported in the article, and it's quite plausible in a pastoral culture where rain ensured more abundant grass for cattle. But again, altogether now, we don't know. We've talked about content and context. What do you think the function of this and the other rock art was? We don't know. Maybe the artists were making magic. Maybe they were just capturing their daily lives, following that human impulse to art that we will be exploring the entire year. My husband, who is a law professor and not an art historian, made an observation that I found interesting. Cowboys, he noted, produced a lot of rock art in Utah. His theory is that cowboys, who after all are pastoralists like the people who painted these works in Algeria, they had a lot of time on their hands while they were fending off coyotes and watching cows munch grass. Maybe these pastoral peoples, too, were whiling away the hours. What observations can you make about form? Well, I see strong contour lines. Notice the white lines contrasting with the black interiors. The draped material on her sleeves overlapping her arms creates a sense of volume. The lines are likewise vertical, emphasizing perhaps strength and power. I did not create this splendid graphic. Some other art history teacher did. It does show the various works that are required by the College Board. A little hard to see here, but you see that they are very geographically dispersed. and I want to use this to make an important point. We are looking for, and I think we're finding, similarities across very disparate cultures. But please, do not leap to the assumption that these cultures influenced each other. Instead, think about what common human experiences might produce commonalities in art. On to our next required work. The subject or content of both the pottery bushel container from Susa, Iran, and the much earlier cave paintings from Lascaux is animals. What are the most striking differences between these animal images? So here's a hint. How would you, I'm sorry, I got messed up on my slides. There we go. Here's a hint. How would you describe the difference between the two elephants and the two donkeys? Well, obviously the animals on top are being used iconographically. That is, these animals are being used as symbols of two political parties. But by the way, both symbols grew out of insults that the parties chose to embrace. Stay tuned for AP Government. The animals on top are also highly stylized, while the animals below are much more naturalistic. So here are more examples of pottery from Susa. Again, we see these highly geometric forms. The ibex's body is composed of two connected triangles with an almost perfect semicircle below. That circular shape is, of course, echoed in those spectacular horns. The snake's head is shaped as a diamond. The works also rely heavily on rhythm, on repeated shapes. I especially like the repeated greyhounds that chase around the top of the ibex bushel, and also the water birds. And we'll see that when we look at the whole piece again in just a minute. As I hope you learned from your reading, art historians and archaeologists are still debating, how was this pottery made? Art historians and archaeologists are still debating this. The pots are remarkably smooth, but not quite smooth enough to suggest a pottery wheel, although some scholars think that the artist may have used a slow hand wheel. Why would smoothness make a difference? It is a lot easier to paint on a smooth surface, and finding a smooth surface on which to paint or draw was actually a serious challenge for early people. They couldn't just walk down to Office Depot and get a ream of paper. Paper did not exist yet. Flat rock surfaces worked. So did smooth pottery. Stay tuned for papyrus, vellum, and finally paper, which was one of the huge technological breakthroughs in art. We may not think of paper as a high technology, but it made a very big difference. What about context? According to archaeological findings, which means this could change with new discoveries, pottery first appeared during the Paleolithic era in East Asia before spreading to the Middle East and the Mediterranean basin during the Neolithic period, thousands of years later. You see some examples here. These are not required images, but I think they're interesting. Pottery represented a huge advance in civilization. And why? Well, clay vessels were much better for storing and transporting valuable goods such as grain, wine, or vegetable oil, much better than baskets or containers carved from wood. So pottery helped societies create a surplus against bad times and promoted trade between peoples, which of course also promoted cultural exchange. As I just noted, pottery also provided an excellent surface for art. It's no surprise that pottery emerged in Mesopotamia, which is modern-day Iran and Iraq, and we'll be talking about that in our next unit. This region is right in the middle of the overland trade routes heading west out of China. Pottery appeared in Persia around 8000 BCE, and it was in this region that two hugely important developments seem to have occurred. East Asian potters had fired, that is, heated their ceramics, but the Persians developed pit kilns and then stone-lined kilns, which allowed firing at much higher temperatures, and this improved the reliability and the durability of pots. In addition, the potter's wheel was invented and developed in Mesopotamia, sometime between 6000 and 4000 BCE, and this led to a surge in ceramic vessels of all types and sizes. Basically, you could just produce a lot more of them. By the way, other cultures also invented the pottery wheel. Historians debate over who got there first. Do we know more about the context of this work, which is required? Well, the pot was found in a cemetery at the foot of the Susa Acropolis, a collection of public buildings on a hill. We'll encounter another Acropolis or two in this course. Because archaeologists have not found domestic dwellings in Susa or artifacts associated with such dwellings. They don't really know if these were special ceremonial objects or examples of pottery that was used in everyday life, ordinary life, and was placed into graves. The content of the vase, though, may offer some hints about context. This passage that I've put on the slide is from the Louvre Museum website, and I probably should have assigned it as reading. You needed some more homework, right? Anyway, we've put the link up on Moodle, but I've also underlined what I think are the most important points. I'm going to ask Ms. Jacobs to pause the video here so that you can take notes in your workbook. What you'll notice is that artists are capturing aspects of daily life, much like the Algerian cave artists appeared to have, but rendering them in a stylized, abstracted geometric form. Moving on, probably not quickly enough, to our next required work. Would you call the form of this sculpture carved from bone stylized or naturalistic? I personally think it's remarkably naturalistic, and here's my evidence. The dog on the right is Tori, one of my two Kazans. Note especially the resemblance around the snouts. Warning, my dogs will show up in lectures again. You should have read a very interesting article on this work. The author theorizes that this was a ceremonial mask, quite possibly used in shamanistic rituals. And what is some of the evidence he uses to support the theory that this was associated with ritual and with spiritual matters? Well, there's the sacrum bone itself, and it got this name because so many cultures hold it sacred. It's associated with procreation and with resurrection in a number of Middle Eastern cultures. The author also relates the use of sacrum to later Mesopotamian mythology from the same geographical area. In Mesoamerican cosmology, spirits move back and forth between the spirit and earth worlds through openings that iconographically are depicted as the mouth and the anus, often of serpents. Again, the skull and the sacrum. Again, please remember that without written records, all of this is conjecture. The connections that we like to draw between prehistoric art and historic cultures that followed it could be wrong. We aren't certain. Maybe the artist really just loved her dog. On to our next work. It is extraordinary to think that this stone sculpture was carved with stone tools. So, what was its function? It was probably a mortar and pestle, actually just the pestle part, the mortar is missing, a simple tool used to grind grain or roots to make them easier to cook and digest. The mortar that you see on the left is actually from the Mayan civilization of Mesoamerica. Other mortars and pestles have been found in Papua New Guinea, dated from around this time, and they are an artifact that we see in cultures all over the world. It's one of those tools that seems like the pottery wheel that was invented in different cultures at different times. So what animal are we seeing? The leading theory seems to be that this is the embryo of a now extinct form of anteater, an animal that had lots of yummy fat on its body and therefore was highly valued. An excellent food source. But again, we don't know for certain. The photo is the echidna's modern-day ancestor, the spiny anteater. So, is this work stylized or naturalistic? I would say stylized, but without a good look at the extinct anteater, it's hard to know. I've copied a passage from the website of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and this link is up on Moodle as well. Note that the meaning and function are unknown, back to the problem of prehistoric art. You should know the term totemic, by the way. It means a natural object or an animal that an animate being, such as an animal or bird, that is used as the emblem of a clan, a family, a group, even an individual. Remember that archaeologists thought some of the motifs on the ibex beaker might have represented a clan, especially likely since it was found at a gravesite. What I find most interesting about this description is that modern-day people of New Guinea assume that these images were made by the gods and use them as sacred objects and rituals. In other words, the function of this object has changed probably in a very significant way. It's a terrific example of changing meaning over time, which is a big College Board theme. Okay, last required work for now, at least for today. There is actually some dispute about the origins of the Lapita people, but here's the most widely accepted theory. Around 1500 BC, a culture known as Lapita appeared in Oceania and then moved into more remote corners of the South Pacific. Recent DNA analysis suggests that they came from the islands of Southeast Asia. What's really important is that these migrants had learned how to explore the open sea and survive. When we get to Mesoamerica, we will learn that there is at least some evidence, again, this is a subject of some dispute, that they made it all the way to South America. At any rate, they brought Neolithic technologies, including pottery, and they also carried with them domesticated animals and plants, the yam and the coconut, pigs and dogs, among others. The Lapita are the ancestors of the Polynesians, including the Maori of New Zealand. Stay tuned for our unit on Pacific art, and we'll revisit this object then. So what would the function of this pottery likely have been? Archaeologists have mostly just found pottery shards or pieces, but the photo on the right shows a partly reconstructed Lapita pot. The pottery may have had ceremonial uses, but archaeologists guessed, based on the shapes and where these shards were found, that the Lapita pottery was used for domestic utility, primarily cooking or storing food. Again, remember the context. This was a Neolithic culture, people often on the move who had the beginnings of established agriculture. Pottery was terrific for storage. Keep in mind, too, that not all highly decorated items had ritual or ceremonial uses. Think of the palette of Narmer, which you learned about this summer. It was a palette for eye makeup, right? These photos also give us a glimpse of the technique that ceramic artists used. The patterns were incised into wet clay with a sharp comb-like tool in elaborate patterns. So what is the content of this ceramic art? Well, mostly we see repeated geometric patterns with a very defined rhythm, but we also see a recognizable but thoroughly stylized human head. Was it a person? Was it an ancestor? Was it a god? We don't know. The geometric patterns themselves are fascinating. Let's watch just the first minute or so of a video that analyzes some of these patterns. If you want to watch the rest, it's up on Moodle. Remember that when exploring the meaning of prehistoric art, art historians and ethnographers often look to historic work by people who later inhabit the area. It's a little tricky with Lapita because actually this elaborate pottery died out and was replaced by much simpler ceramic art. Some scholars, however, have suggested that the patterns live on in one of the most iconic forms of Pacific art, the tattoo. So here is a 19th century engraving of a Polynesian warrior from the Marquesa Islands. I tried to blow up a portion of the tattoo. The image on the right comes from another piece, another Lapita pottery fragment. Again, we see the use of geometric patterns. We see rhythm. We see symmetry, that is kind of a mirror imaging, and a combination of symbols and stylized human faces. We're going to return to faces, some very odd faces, in our last prehistoric art lesson.